Especially Gen AI, I think there's decent interest everywhere, especially because the simplest chatbots are not difficult to build. It's a more secular trend. For example, 2014, 2015, when oil hit like $40 a barrel. At that time, everything was constrained, right? Even capital investments and technology obviously takes a big chop off. The last few years have been quite good. There is enough cash flowing in to make all these futuristic investments. Industry 4.0 is largely based in terms of connectivity and sensors. One of the key factors is how do we drive more automation, data-driven decision making in the manufacturing space or in the capital-intensive plant side of things.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Long Game. In today's episode, my guest is Deepak Chintala, a director at Ernst & Young Middle East. He has a wealth of experience in strategy consulting, and specifically, we talk about the oil and gas refinery sector, which he knows so well. We talk about digital twins of software assets and hardware assets being married in meat space and virtual space. We talk about the rise of AI, of course, and how it is being applied to the sector with potential for growth in process automation. And we talk about the nature of the Middle East and how companies there are far more backed by the government, which changes the goals and economic impact of these organizations. We talk about this and much more, so please sit back and enjoy my conversation with Deepak. So Deepak, why did you decide to start focusing on consulting, particularly in the asset-intensive sectors?
So largely, I think it was more opportunity driven when I started. So around, like I said, I initially started off more in I was focused more on retail, e-commerce and online channels basically. So it was a very consumer driven, marketing focused work that I was doing. As I said, I was largely working for retail or technology companies. But then around 2018, 19, I think that's when I started focusing on these sectors. And primarily one of the things was these sectors were generally considered as laggards when it came to digital transformation.
Considered what?
They were considered as lagging behind. Sectors like financial services or retail would be would be tip of the spear. They would be very advanced when it comes to adopting new technology and engaging new ways of working. But when it comes to some of these capital intensive industries, especially oil and gas, they were considered lagging behind when it came to digital technologies, right? Now they have their own core technology, which is very complex, right? It's a very technology-led industry as well, but it's very different from the traditional IT or digital technology that we typically associate with tech, right? So that's when I started focusing on them because a lot of them, especially I was based in India back then, and all these companies wanted to build like a strategy and have a roadmap, have some sort of an operating model where they could understand how do they bring this new ways of working into the organizations, right? Because a lot of them were, as I said, the focus on, when you look at capital intensive industries, the big focus is on building these capital assets, right? So if you're talking in terms of, money spent.
What do you mean by building these capital assets? Like what does that ultimately mean?
So it depends on what you're doing. For example, if you are like a petrochemical company, right? Building a petrochemical plant is tens of billions of dollars, right? Spans over like multiple years.
So a lot of cash to build a
A
petrol
lot of
company.
cash. It's a lot of money, right? And when you think about it, that's where the whole it's massive amounts of money we're talking about, right? When you're talking about the technology spent, relatively, it's a tiny proportion, right? So a lot of focus always is in and the focus is always on engineering and making sure that being efficient with their capital expenditures, and even operating them also. It's just that in terms of the overall scheme of things, the technology spent, or when I say technology, I mean more on the IT side, not on the operational technology. Because their focus heavily when they talk about technologies on the operational technologies where they're operating these large machines, turbines, which come with their own, proprietary technologies, right? When it comes to, and these are typically also, traditionally used to be insulated because, they didn't want to protect themselves, right? So they typically
like the manufacturers of the hardware.
The manufacturers typically maintain a separate plant network.
Software.
Yeah, they maintain a separate plant network, and they don't want to connect to the internet, for example, right? So what has happened over time was that these core technologies, the compute power they had, the analytics capabilities that are available on the plant network were very limited, right? And but that's where the core operation runs from, right? So this is where they were really behind, and then these companies, wanted to have like a refresh strategy on how do they go about this, right? And also just the ways of working, right, is very different. A lot of these companies are state-owned or public sector, right? The way they're organized, they're structured is very different. When you talk about being nimble and agile is something that these companies are not used to, right? Because they again operate on these long-term capital assets, which takes the like 5, 7, 10 years to build, and they're going to operate for the next 30 to 50 years, right?
I think that's one of the things that's actually very interesting about the Middle East, which is, where you focus right now. You're based in Doha in Qatar. And when I was there, I visited Doha, I visited Dubai, and then also Riyadh in Saudi Arabia.
Nice.
And all of those cities are, the state has a very large presence in
Right.
the economy, in what is focused on where the or the currency flows and where the investments flow. So given you've spent some time in the States and you've worked with US companies, and then you've also spent time in the Middle East, what's it like working with industry that is backed in large part by the state or by the government? How does that differ in terms of how you're able to get things done or what the focuses are?
So I think, so in the US, since North America especially, these are all like private companies where the objective of the company is to maximize shareholder value. As well. Everything you do is to build an efficiency, bring more profits to it. But when you take the perspective in the Middle East, now there are two different perspectives. The traditional perspective has been about, see, the whole, these companies drive the local economy, right? So efficiency is not always the central objective of what these companies want to, companies want to drive it, right? Because you do need to employ. There's a whole focus on nationalization where you need to generate good opportunities for nationals to be employed in. At the same time, they also if you look at Doha, just if you go walk around the city, you see it's pretty flashy. A lot of nice hotels, a lot of nice places. So you need people who will go to these places, right? So it's always about it's not purely linked to generating maximum value for the company, but it operates as a whole of system approach, right? Where the whole country's economy is essentially driven by some of these very large companies, right? So that is one approach. But if you look at what is happening of late, especially in Saudi Arabia and UAE, where these companies are now being, since they are the largest companies in the country, these are being, they're helping drive the technology and innovation in the country as well. So, for example, Aramco, is literally creating a technology arm for
For
itself.
anyone who doesn't know Aramco, you mind just giving a little
Yeah,
background
so
about them?
Aramco is the largest national oil company in the Middle East. It's the largest oil company in the world, owned by the state of Saudi Arabia. It's a public listed company with almost $2 trillion in market cap. And it's probably the most profitable company in the world for the last few years. Generates more profits than like all the Magnificent Seven in the US combined. So, but now Aramco, though, they are, since the government of Saudi Arabia has a lot of influence on Aramco. Aramco is investing a lot in technology. Like almost like technologies that are still in their infancy, like metaverse, for example, right, or blockchain. Now there's talk of how do we use Starlink, right? Because these companies have the cash and the resources to actually explore some of these new technologies and incubate them for the country as a whole. So Aramco, for example, is trying to build these as a technology competency within the country that can then be adopted by other companies in the country outside the sector, right? So Aramco becomes the incubator, which has the money to invest in technology and attract talent, and that builds a hub which can then be spread to across the country, right? It could spread to other sectors within the country. And so
I think it's really interesting to kind of tie into the economic stimulation aspect of these companies with the example you're setting with Aramco. As a consultant and having that
yeah,
experience in digital transformation and consulting, when you focus on helping a company make more profit, it's a very clear objective. You're looking
yes,
for efficiency, you're looking for improvement, you're looking for something of that nature. So with these kind of publicly backed companies, there is obviously you want to have growth and you want to have
yes.
stimulation, but you also want to have these other objectives. So as a consultant, how do you balance the outcomes and objectives to make sure that you are, yes, helping the business grow, but then also achieving the goals of the public sector?
So this is where the whole concept of the digital strategy comes in for especially these sectors. I think this is one difference I saw when I was in the US versus when I moved back to India or like the Middle East. Is in the US, most, especially the sectors that I've worked in, like, retail and technology, these are like, uh, they are already digitally mature, and when they focus on a digital initiative, it's very business focused. There's a very specific outcome. But when it comes to these, like India or in the Middle East, especially in these, asset-intensive companies, that's where the whole digital concept of digital strategy comes up, because then you want to identify a vision and what you want to do as a company, right? Now, some of them could be very operational, and then you define what are the pillars that drive your vision, right? Your digital vision. Now, that's how we compartmentalize, right, based on leadership vision, because some of them are very operations focused, right, which obviously bring in, help them do things better, right? And I mean, it's not like they completely ignore the market aspects, but as it's not the only driver for them, as it would be in a North American company, right?
Do
So,
you find that these conflict ever when you're managing the priorities across the profits as well as the, economic growth and stimulation?
so as I said, some of them, but so everything that you do, as it the vision, when we create the vision, we identify like, what are the key pillars and themes that you want to focus on. And some of these themes could be very, focused on operational efficiency and helping them improve their daily work. But some could be very innovative, right? That the whole objective of it is to be innovative and drive innovation, right? So the key challenge is about funding, right? How do you get funding and how much funding do you get? So typically, what's the business case for some of these initiatives, right? But as I said, so it depends on the country, that's just it, right? If the objective is that they're willing to invest in new tech, for example, metaverse, right? You want to build something in metaverse, you could, but most smaller companies would not be able to invest that money. Right? There's no business case for it, right? But if you're a large company, and one of the objectives for you is to incubate some of these future technologies into the country, then you might be willing to invest in it, right? So it depends on that, and that's where we have these key focus areas, and then you have like a roadmap sort of thing which drives how do you approach each one of these themes, right? So that's typically how we do it. So it's a balance, and typically, as I said, and most companies, as there are exceptions like in Saudi Arabia and UAE also to an extent, where they're willing to invest in these, but for other countries in the region, it is more operations focused. And everybody likes to have an innovation bucket, but again, how much investment goes into it, it really depends, right?
It's
And
kind of balancing,
it's
yeah,
kind of
how many
balancing, yeah.
dollars do you want to put into
And well,
R&D and innovation, but then also into getting things done and
yeah, if the
operational
oil price is
efficiency?
good, then a lot of investment goes in. But if there's tightening of oil prices, then a lot of things will dry up very soon. But I think the last few years
That's
have been really
it.
good.
Is there a lot of like reactivity? Is it kind of short lived? If oil price has been down the last 3 months, budgets are cut, everything's slashed, or is it more from a year to year
Not that
perspective?
short term, but it's a more secular trend. For example, like 2014, 2015, when oil hit like $40 a barrel. Now, at that time, like, everything was constrained, right? Even capital investments, like even their own capital investments, were severely constrained, and technology obviously takes a big chop off, right? But I think the last few years have been quite good. Oil prices going, consistently staying around 80 to 100. I think there is enough cash flowing in to make all these, futuristic investments.
Talk to me about Industry 4.0. I was reading about that when researching you, and it's a new concept to me.
So yeah, so Industry 4.0 is largely looking at it is called the fourth industrial revolution. That how we are evolving from starting with steam engines to having more automation. I think Industry 4.0 is largely based in terms of connectivity and sensors. Like IoT is a big component of that. Is largely looking at one of the key factors is how do we drive more automation and data-driven decision making in the manufacturing space or in the capital intensive plant side of things. So that's where Industry 4.0 focuses on. And when you look at the adoption, it depends. It varies a lot, depending on the industry and the company what they're doing. So that's where Industry 4.0 comes in. And when I look at the biggest use cases generally are around, are around like, operations, maintenance, inspection. These are areas where, trying to bring in new technologies. So this is basically saying that in a quantum leap, in terms of, how you're operating a certain thing, can you completely have like what we call as a lights out operation where there is like no human intervention, right? You have like a facility where, there are drones or robots which are scanning it and, monitoring it. Then you have, like, sensors everywhere, so that, any movement that happens or any inspection that needs to happen can be automated. And then there are corrective measures through a digital twin, right? So where you can, make.
What's the digital twin? Explain that concept and how
So a
you use it
digital
within this
twin,
automation world.
yeah. So digital twin is like is like a simulation version of reality. Now there are multiple types of digital twins. The most common twin that you'd see is like an asset twin. So if you have like a machine, then you have a digital replica of it. When I say replica, it has its you know, depending on how it's built, it has all the components simulated into a computer with real-time sensors linked to it. So instead of, actually checking a physical machine, you could check it out in your computer, right? And what it allows you
I
is,
think yeah, the concept of just having, just to make sure it's really painted is you have a factory and you have a
yes,
bunch of machines in that factory and they have a bunch of different sensors reporting data on each of them. And so rather than just kind of looking at a dashboard with all of that data, you create a virtual reality
correct.
which has a digital version of that machine. And then you feed in all the sensors so it's actually performing
Yes,
and tracking, matching to the real world, the physical world machine. And then you could go into that virtual reality, you can inspect it, you can look around at different parts of it and see where the wear and tear is. And I think that concept is just extremely fascinating of
it is.
building
Yeah, and
a
it's not
fake
just.
world based on the real world
Yeah,
data.
and it's not just that. It's more about what if scenarios, because now in a real world scenario you will not be able to try out certain scenarios with your machine because you're worried about the risks. But in a simulated reality, you could just try out any simulations that you want, right? Any
If I
scenario.
ran it twice as fast, would
Yeah,
it
and align
break?
twice.
Or
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And the bigger one, this is typically what you see as digital twin is the asset twin. But I think a more powerful version of is like having a process twin, whereas you mentioned, I have now an interconnected set of assets, right? And all of these, there's a process that flows through all these assets. Now, simulating that is difficult, but then the value could be really, really high, right? You could really change, for example, if you're operating a refinery, you could really reorganize the way the refinery is organized, right? I mean, what you're producing, it can be. Now, all these what if scenarios, I think is something that you could try in a simulated digital twin, right? But again, process twins are really difficult to build, right? What we
So
see
many
most
variables that
commonly,
go into it,
yeah,
and human element is probably involved in it in some way as well. And so kind of replicating all of that being the biggest barrier there.
yeah. And so I mean, so this still has, so as I said, there's still a lot of value in having assets and having uh, planning some of the activities around them, like like for example, maintenance campaigns can be planned around a series of assets as well. Like once you have a 3D model of the whole thing. And this is where it can become more, if you want to keep it real, as I said, there's real-time sensors which is publishing, pushing data into it. Then you could have inspection through, uh, drones and other things which can give you like an exact as is state of the equipment or the assets. Because a lot of them, for example, if you have a platform, it's subject to degradation, and there is which come from inspection, right? So if you could, again, this is a use case for,
Basic wear and
bringing
tear
in,
for
yeah.
all assets.
So you could have like drones monitoring it, and the same thing then reflect in the digital twin, so that at any given time it's real, right? So a lot of things now. This is all part of Industry 4.0, which completely changes the way you could work, right? Instead of these being places where everything was done physically, you could now have a complete simulated reality where you have access to all these things. And as I said, the most importantly, you can try out scenarios which you could never do it in the real world, right?
I want to challenge you a little bit. I read Isaac Walterson's
Mm.
biography on Elon Musk a few years ago,
Yeah.
and in it, it talks about Tesla. His original vision for the Tesla plant was to have automation end to end.
Yes.
So having, an entire
Models.
car manufactured using robots and using these processes where a robot does step one, and then it hands it off to a different robot, which does step two and three. And I remember very vividly a section of the book where they were trying to hit a deadline, and
Yes.
so they ended up just looking at the data, walking down the line, and I think spray painting in red X's on the machines that they were going to rip out, or something to that effect.
Yes.
And they found that by removing these machines, removing this automation, they were able to achieve their goals and their deadlines far faster due to removing the constraints of the technology and of the hardware. So, how much of this is about still having people involved because people can do things that
Yes.
machines can't and they can be more adaptable, versus are we moving towards a world where these plants and machines are ultimately end to end fully autonomous?
I think, as I said, right, when you talk about the digital twin itself, as I said, the asset twin is very desirable and it's very common, right? A lot of industries today have it. But when you talk about this process twin, where you're, working across a series of assets, right? This is where, it becomes very complicated and how the interactions happen, right? And before we jump to, new technology, but, if you look at traditional way of building these things, it's all logic based, right? Now it depends on what you code and what you build. It's almost impossible to anticipate every single scenario that might happen in a physical world, right? And that's where some of these complications come up, right? When there are edge case scenarios which may not be built, right? Or it might be just too complex. That's the thing with humans, right? Humans are adaptable, right? We're dexterous. We can adapt. We can think on our feet. A machine can't do that, right? A machine is programmed to think in a certain linear way. Until we talk about the new Gen AI, which we can discuss later, but traditionally it is all logic based. It's sequential. It's defined uh, based on certain input. There's a certain expected output from a machine, right? But humans could
Well,
really,
let's
yeah,
yeah, let's I mean let's
really
go there
adapt.
to artificial intelligence, right? So you're kind of talking about that adaptability of humans, which has been one of our biggest
Holy
strengths
grails,
for
yeah.
all of humanity, right? But
And
now we
especially
have
in Model
artificial
S that you
intelligence.
mentioned, I think in Model S that they've actually do some level of human intervention, and also like the most if you look at even in the auto industry, it the bill of materials that used to build a car is very complex. Not many when you need like a lot of customization. For example, the most expensive Bentleys and Maybachs in Rolls Royce, a lot of them are built manually. There's little automation in them, whereas the mass manufactured cars are usually automated, but the most luxurious cars are even till date built largely manually because of the level of customization required. And managing
Yeah,
just the
probably
bill
the
of
number of
materials
parts, the
is quite
complexity of
complex.
assembly.
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. So where does AI and Gen AI specifically maybe come up in your world with consulting through EY, with the oil and gas, or with other sectors? Is it something that everyone's interested in but not really leaning into, or are the early movers saying, "Oh, we can generate so much more efficiency because we can have more intelligently driven processes, workflows,
Yeah.
multi-agent architecture is kind of integrated within our operations and back office, and they're really trying to explore and innovate on that side."
Yeah, I think this is one of the things about digital tech. Irrespective of the industry you work in, which we used to call in customer experience, we call it liquid expectations. Is people generally
Liquid
that
expectations.
it's generally that the expectations flow across sectors right now. So the people who work in the oil and gas industry also interact with Google. They book their cabs to Uber, right? They get food through online delivery applications. The way they interact with banks, when they come to work, they expect similar experience, right? They
Interesting.
don't, even though the sector is behind, right? A lot of it is in operations and heavy assets and heavy machinery, but the way they interact with technology in in the daily life, they expect similar experience. They would like similar experience in their work as well. So I think Gen AI is super hot, especially in the clients that I'm working with. I mean, we've organized like digital days where we've invited whole set of vendors. Most of them focused on heavy operations, drones, everything, right? But the most interest, everybody found was, in like the Microsoft booth, where they were
Of
focusing
course.
Copilot, and everybody's like, I need this tomorrow, right? And everybody loves it. I think Copilot adoption is, the people are driving that. There are some risks to it, but I think there's a lot of interest in Gen AI. Especially, I think the simplest use cases we're building right now are more related to Document insights. Now, for example, and these are different kinds of documents. Right? The basic version could be like process manuals, for example, right? Where instead of going through a manual, you could just chat and you can get it. But the more useful one is coming from the operations side, where they have historical data from years and years. I think one of the key things always has been in oil and gas, some of these sectors has been like, how do we retain the knowledge of our employees, right? Now, I know we are not there yet, but now this is something, somebody who has worked there for 30 years, for example, you are drilling in a certain location and they've been there for 20 years. There's so much knowledge that the person has, right? And you could say that, wait, 20 years ago, this is what happened here. We tried doing this, but then this happened, and then this is how we managed it, right? Now, all those reports, so traditionally, this is very difficult to access this information. Right? You either have the person or somebody has to spend hours digging through it. Now, I think Gen AI, I think that's the biggest use case that is coming around. It's quite simple to implement, but is that can I feed all my historical reports of last 50 years, and then I can ask for patterns and can understand what happened when and what are my top issues. So there is a lot of interest, and I've been involved in building some of these use cases recently. It was quite quick to build.
Do you have any examples you could talk through in terms of the impact that having these, really what you're talking about is a RAG chatbot implementation
RAG
with
models
historical
basically,
documentation,
and RAG as well largely, leveraging the like Qatar, for example, is largely a Microsoft shop because of the local data center here. So it's largely again based on Azure AI, Azure AI search. So it's basically RAG model with some orchestrator built in. So as I said, the benefits, a lot of it is coming in terms of time saving. As I said, some of these people, especially when I'm talking about upstream, you have this entire reservoir engineers or drilling engineers. They spend a lot of time, almost like I can say 4 to 5 hours a week, just pouring through reports, right? Now that can be done in like minutes now, right? And also so that's the biggest value right now is coming in terms of time saving. What we are still exploring, we haven't reached there, is to see how some of this can be incorporated into decision making, right? And that hasn't happened.
Decision making
And being part of some workflow, right, where you get this input, you do something, then you maybe have reach it out, share it to the human, and then the human does something, and then you act on it, right?
Where would you say the biggest barrier to adoption of this is? Because it sounds like people are very excited about it, and yet there is this lagging aspect in the oil and gas that you were describing, or asset-backed sectors of trailing behind from adoption of technology. So is it just inherent to this industry that they're going to move a little bit slower, or are there other barriers that you're encountering and having pushback against?
I think the barriers, especially with Gen AI, I think there's decent interest everywhere, especially because these are not difficult to build. The simplest chatbots are not difficult to build. I think the barrier, one of the constraints I could see coming is, in terms of access controls, right? Now one of the things is, historically, especially with something like Copilot, the thing is, a lot of times, organizations haven't implemented access controls as well as you'd like them to be, right? I mean, there is now, and when a company does something like a data classification exercise, and the companies, these are all like new things, done in the last 5-6 years maybe, So traditionally, a lot of, for example, you might have access to a lot of files and folders that you never knew about, right? It's just granted access sometime, somewhere, right? Everybody forgot about it. You don't look at it either, right? Nobody knows. Nobody keeps drilling into every single folder on the shared file to see what files have access to. Nobody does that, right?
But let alone reading all of them.
Yeah, but now with Copilot, right, or something like this, which just scans the entire thing, you suddenly start seeing things that you never knew you had access to, right? And this is quite difficult from the organization perspective, that they did not implement these fine-grained access controls in the past, right? And it was not exposed, right? But with these new technologies, I think that's one of the things that keeps coming up is just the level of access, right? But this is again largely for general like Copilot sort of use cases. But if you're building very specific applications, you could still restrict access to a particular set of users. So that I think is one specific area that is coming up, and the second also is that as I said, right now the use cases are quite generic, right? The current GPTs and the current LLMs are fine, but I think there's more in terms of building more specialized bots, right, going forward. Now that how they will come about is to be seen, right? Where because there's one
Do you have
thing
any
that
predictions? So, kind of looking 5, 10 years down the road, given you're seeing movement across multiple businesses,
yes, I
and
think that's one
where
simple
do you think we're going?
one common thing is that you'll need like a sort of, because the thing is these LLMs are not very good at calculations and math, right? Now a lot of
But
them
we'll probably figure that out at some
yes.
point,
So
right?
right now it has to be sort of, because that is also an important requirement for many of the use cases. So right now I think we're looking at building some kind of hybrid search where you there's a part which comes from the LLM and there's a part which comes from a more structured source where you can do the calculations, right? And it's going to be a combination of them. But I think going forward, what would be interesting to see if you can build some context into it, right? So, for example, a reservoir engineer looking at a certain report would be very different from just like an English language bot looking at it, right? So I think that's something that
And the knowledge, the training,
the
the
training,
lens through which
yeah.
the model can look at the
And I
data.
could see this in EY, for example, in our own like in-house version of ChatGPT that we have. They're building this, they call it skills, and this is something that it's still in early stages, but they're trying to build this saying that, hey, if I'm a tax specialist, how do I look at this information? Does my search differ? Does my chat experience differ from the general chat experience versus I being a tax specialist or a technology specialist? I think that'll be interesting to see because I think that'll add a lot of value. But I think it's very interesting right now, and the good thing about it is just the speed with which you could build some of these things. A lot
The
of them
speed
can
at
be
which it's
available
innovating.
drive. Yeah. With the cloud providers, Microsoft, Amazon, and Google, it's quite easy to build some of these. And as it is massive interest because ChatGPT is hot everywhere. Everyone's been talking about it, and people do want that in their day-to-day work as well. Simple
I
drafting
believe it.
emails, for example, right? I mean, people have tried to restrict them, saying that it's not allowed, but then everybody started doing it on their phone, for example, right? So, so there's you
It's
have
funny.
to
It's
adopt.
funny how technology will find a way. If
Yeah.
people want to do something more efficiently and more effectively, it doesn't matter how many bans or blockers you put up, they will probably find a way to do
Yeah.
it. To close us out, is there any technology that you are very excited about that you think doesn't get enough attention, whether for your particular sector or sectors that you've worked with before in the past?
I mean, a lot of them actually, to be honest, if you look at it, a lot of investment is typically focused on analytics, right? And now with AI becoming hot, and just focus largely on data and analytics, right? I think the others, don't seem to get a lot of traction. Uh, for example, I think one thing I think is blockchain. For example, is we've been talking about blockchain for years now. No real world applications, especially simple things like uh, invoices, right? I mean, for example, the ideal case of a blockchain is if you have a private blockchain, then the whole concept of invoices goes away, right? You can have smart contracts, and the moment a smart contract is executed, payment is released, or your contractual terms are executed automatically, right? Now that you'd assume it would be like something, right? But that's again, and a lot of these companies operate like are international companies as well, right? So there's a lot of cross-border payments and transfers that happen. So that's something that hasn't never picked up. Honestly, when I try to look for real world examples where this has been done, very far and few. Few here, few there. But I think that's supposed to be a promising technology from like years ago, right? And there's very little traction on that. Drones again, I think this decent adoption, but I think it's largely regulatory issues that curtail the usage of them. Right? There's most countries have very strict regulations on how do you operate a drone and who's allowed to operate a drone, right? And it has to be line of sight. A lot of regulatory restrictions in terms of where drones could do much more. We could, be much. There could be a lot more use of them, but that's again that hasn't picked. Um, and as I said, the big investment, the push, everything, the all the advances you see is largely on the data side of things. Data analytics, and now building on that, AI, machine learning is. These are the areas that really hot. Uh, Rest, I think, there's so much more, right? That can be done as well. I mean, again, the adoption has been pretty low, right? I mean, it could be much more than what it is today.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate your thoughts, Deepak. Thanks so
Yeah.
much for coming on the show. It's been a very insightful conversation.
Sure. Thank you so much for your time.
If you enjoyed that episode, make sure you check out this video right here. And if you really enjoyed it and you listened to the end, take 2 seconds and share the love so someone else might find it by clicking the thumbs up button and subscribing. I appreciate you, and I hope you have a wonderful day. But click that button.